Do you see more stringent anti-terrorism laws being enacted and more countries having these types of laws?
Well, there being more stringent laws are being enacted all over the place. A lot of it is for cosmetic public consumption and really not going very much further in terms of real new constraints than has already existed in law. But governments love to be seen to be doing something, and my own, I think, is probably no exception to that. The critical thing is that we do have international intelligence cooperation, we do have international criminal law enforcement cooperation, and the critical thing is that we keep the communities with us. I mean, Islamic community is no different from anyone else in our respective countries. They're full of absolutely decent people who are horrified about what is presently being done in the name of their religion. And it's very, very, very important that we keep that community sentiment on side and don't overreach in our domestic reaction or in the way in which we handle ourselves militarily in the Middle East by killing innocent civilians in the name of a greater good. Very important that this be done in a very moderate way, because it's keeping that community support that is so crucial, as you would know here in the Philippines, in dealing with domestic homegrown terrorism.
Do you feel that the U.S. is sort of treading on dangerous ground here?
It is treading on dangerous ground, and I think President Obama is acutely aware of that. I liked his initial articulation of the justification for doing what they're doing in humanitarian grounds. I think it is overwhelmingly a humanitarian operation that we're seeing, and an anti-genocide, anti-atrocity crime. Once we see, the discourse has got a bit more confused. We're now getting obsessed with terrorism and beheadings and all the rest of it. And so much of the Islamic world is so cynical about this, saying, well, you didn't move when 200,000 people were getting killed in Syria, 2 Americans get beheaded, and you move like crazy. It's important that we go back to basics here and say, look, the reason we're acting is we couldn't do anything much in Syria. We can do something, however, in Iraq. We're doing it for good humanitarian, good international citizenship reasons. We're doing it because we should do it in defence of our common humanity. That's the rationale that will appeal to our own citizens in our own countries and keep the support for this government action. And that's the best rationale for ensuring that we don't get a negative perception, a negative backlash from the Islamic countries concerned.
I'd like to shift to South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea. You said at some point, years back, that some of the countries are overreacting to China. Do you still hold that same view, considering that China has been building structures in the area, in the disputed area, and it has refused arbitration, in fact?
Yeah, I don't think China has very much to be proud of in the way in which it has been handling the South China or West Philippine Sea issue. It's really, by persisting with this notion of the historical claim, the 9-dashed line, it really is acting outside any accepted or acceptable framework of international law. Fine for it to make sovereign claims to bits and pieces of land and rocks and territory around the South China Sea in exactly the same way as the Philippines makes such claims, and Vietnam makes such claims, other people make such claims. Fine to make the claims, and fine then to build on top of that under the Law of the Sea Convention, UNCLOS, claims to national waters and territorial waters and extended economic zones. And fine on the basis then of those competing claims to get on with bilateral negotiations to try and see if some common agreement can be worked out without people sacrificing their sovereignty claims, their sovereignty positions. But to wander around claiming this sort of broad historical, role and right of some kind to waters on the scale that it is just operating outside any framework with which any country can negotiate with it bilaterally or otherwise. So I really do think China has to fundamentally reconsider what it's doing in this respect and put its claims in terms that others can understand.
Is there a role that you see for Australia?
Not really in this respect. I mean, the Australian government is remaining studiously neutral from taking sides in this. I'm out of government now, so I can be a little bit more noisy on the subject. I do tell my Chinese interlocutors over and over and over again, look, we perfectly well understand that you've got historical claims here and bits and pieces of land and so on. You can make a reasonably plausible claim, but put that claim in terms that are consistent with a rule-based international order, put them in terms that are consistent with the International Law of the Sea Convention, which you've signed, party to, put it in terms that can then be the subject of rational bilateral negotiation. I've been involved myself in negotiations over disputed maritime borders, Indonesia, Australia, and negotiations over the Timor Sea with its oil and gas reserves. Did involve drawing a box around the disputed area with neither side making concessions on the basic sovereignty position, and then agreeing to mutually exploit and mutually share. And the East Timorese government, which has now emerged, has been the beneficiary of that agreement. There are ways of doing this.
Well,
the Philippines is engaged in this.
China has been insisting that it be settled as a bilateral issue
Well,
rather than making it
It can only be settled. I understand what they're saying, and I've settled these things on a bilateral basis in the past. Philippines has negotiated things on a bilateral basis in the past, but it's only when people are talking the same international law language that you can even get to first base. You can have a rational claim, I can have a rational claim. Those claims can overlap, we can disagree. Then you try to work out a diplomatic solution to get the best for everybody, either by arbitration to finally resolve it, or if you can't do that, or if you're unwilling to do that, make some compromises so that you can get mutual development of the area in question, and both sides can benefit. There's all sorts of things you can do bilaterally, but you can't get to first base unless you're operating within that international law framework. And that's what we still have to see from our Chinese colleagues, a willingness to do that. Whether they'll be encouraged to do so by your court action is another interesting question, but I think most of the rest of the world would like to see China operating on that basis.
Maybe just a last question. What do you foresee happening in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of security issues, most especially in the region?
Well, I'm a congenital optimist about things. I mean, people, when you look at the world around you, you say, well, to be an optimist, you must be either ignorant or naive or quite deranged. But I've been around long enough to see the bumps and the grinds and the ups and the downs in bilateral relations and multilateral relations. I don't think anyone wants to go back to an age of full-scale war. I think we've learned so much from World War II and all the technological developments since then, which have made the prospect of full-scale war so totally unacceptably horrific. I think people will often march up to the brink and there'll be confrontation and we'll have conflicts of various kinds. But basically there's enough common sense among policymakers for us to muddle through. I would like to see a much more constructive approach to some of these difficult issues than we are seeing at the moment from some of the players. But at the end of the day, I think both when it comes to major issues of genocide, atrocity, crimes, the world is no longer comfortable with just saying this is none of our business. It's purely a matter for sovereign states to do what they like to their own people. And I think when it comes to potential violent conflict between countries, there will always be a strong mood to step back from the brink.
But do you
really get out of hand.
But do you see terrorism escalating and becoming a more serious threat?
Is something that cuts across that.
Yeah.
And we should be deeply conscious of the risk. It is real. We know from past experience, and we know about the intentions of these people. If they could only get their act together to do even worse things. But there's also so much more international cooperation about this stuff than there used to be. There's so much more awareness of the way in which these groups and individuals operate. The price of policing this, the price of comfort, is unfortunately a lot of intrusion into our privacy and traditional liberties. We can't be as confidently immune from governmental scrutiny as we'd like to be in all our lives, as part of the price of governments needing to know what's going on. But I think there's enough of this sort of cooperation now occurring to give us some reasonable level of confidence. But that doesn't mean there's not a very big agenda of things to do, and one of the biggest items on the agenda is one of those that's being most neglected at the moment, and that is really getting serious about getting rid of nuclear weapons once and for all.
Okay. Thank you very much for reminding us about having to get rid of nuclear weapons at the time when we're obsessed with terrorism. We've been speaking with Professor Gareth Evans. Thank you for joining us.